I want to thank Professor Enrique Sabejano, his team, Wilfred Wang, and the Universidad des Kunst Berlin for giving me the opportunity to get in touch with you and present you some of the, I think, interesting things that are happening in Latin America, mainly with some examples from my own country, Argentina, but also from other countries like Mexico and Brazil. And this makes sense because in terms of architectural culture, we have strong links between our countries. I would like to underline that I have always had an interest on architecture from the point of view of culture. I mean, I'm not that interested, at least in this presentation, in the personalities of each architect, but in the collective outcome of what they have done in the last perhaps 10 years or a little more. The usual, is to center on the artistic personality of the author. But what I'm trying to look at now is to the process in which they participate together, knowing each other and getting information of what they are doing and how to take advantage of it. Let's see. I'm sorry for my English, but it's better than my German. Well, this interest is, I recall now what Otto Leicher say, which is a German designer, a professor of the School of Ulm. He says, the best designs has no author. And I like this idea. It's so powerful. He said, shoes with laces, nobody knows who invented them. This is a dimension of culture, but it's so powerful. And I think, for instance, the most powerful human instrument has no author, which is language itself. And in our terms, as architects, the city has no author. Of course, we know there are many authors for the city, but they only worked together collectively in a successive of events that have an unique outcome. So as language, each city is different from the other. So these are I think these are the most rich, and it's the underlying, the substratus of cultural architecture. Buenos Aires was already a big metropolitan city in 1930s. In 1929, when Le Corbusier arrived to Buenos Aires, invited by Vittorio Campo, he saw this kind of intense metropolis, and in fact, he made a drawing with all the Americas, pointing to New York and Buenos Aires as if it could be two equivalent, I don't know, they aren't, be sure. But never mind, Buenos Aires was already a very big metropolitan, cosmopolitan city. And here I bring some images just to you have an idea from where I come and from where I talk, and which is the context of the works and the work of these young architects that I'm going to present. These are, well, the big avenues of Buenos Aires that were opened in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It's a regular grid. And one of the interesting things of the city has an architectural texture. It has an urban quality. It is a pedestrian city, which means you can walk. And also, it has an historical architectural heritage. It's not very old, but it's interesting, it's diverse. And most importantly, it has urban life. Well, and nightlife too. Well, as you've seen from the beginning, the idea of infiltration tactics has two kind of ideas. But the idea of tactic has been seen some time ago as opposed to the idea of strategy by Peter Eisenman in a very famous article you will remember, and it's still worth reading it, that was called The End of the Classic. The end of the beginning, the end of the end. In this article, which is, I think, is well, one of the best things Peter Eisenman did, he compares the tactics to strategies as two very different things. Being the tactics based on circumstance, the strategies based on very long-term objectives. So when you work with tactics, you have an open end. You don't know where you go, but you are getting advantage of the opportunities. When you work with a strategy, you have a very long-term goal, and you have a very dogmatic plan. The tactics usually work on the small scale, and the strategies on the big scale. Tactics are multiple because are part of very different people working separately but at the same time. Strategies need a central command who makes all the orders. At the same time, tactics have diversified sources, and strategies require concentrated capital. Tactics works on the short term, and strategies work in the long term. Tactics work within the conditions of the context. Strategy usually erases the context and puts its own terms, its own plans. So what we call the tabula rasa. So if we look at what was happening in the 70s, it was clearly the idea of strategies. Very huge projects. This is an awarded project for social housing in the 70s in Buenos Aires. And these projects, all the power was given to one person. And this enormous quantity of houses were concentrated in this project, where the architectural and the urban project will be in the same hands. Of course, this meant an isolation in many aspects, because these cities were discontinuous with the pre-existing city. And finally, the dwellers were confined, were isolated from the public life in many ways. But the ironic thing, I think, is that in the 90s, these kind of ghettos were voluntary. So if the public housing created these isolated enclaves, alienated from the urban life, in the 90s we would see another kind of strategies in which concentration, concentration of capital and concentration of to big developments just to be able to fix all the urban conditions within the building. So the ironic thing is that the rich isolated themselves in the 90s as would have happened before with social housing. And this voluntary isolation has to do at the same time with a lot of equipment which are called amenities for the buildings. So the residents can book backyard from the street. These enclaves would have only one entrance, and you would go inside by car. So you could avoid public space as much as you can. The buildings will retreat from the street, so they won't collaborate, no longer would collaborate to create a walkable sidewalk. And they would be seen from far, establishing what I call a visual relations with the city. It's a relation in which the city the urban space is no longer an environment, but a landscape. It's a visual relation. So, in contrast, what happened in the end of the 90s, beginning of this century, is that young architects who wanted to work on their own conditions created a new situation, which I called infiltration tactics. They worked in very little scale. They gather some relatives to produce, to gather enough capital to become themselves developers of very little buildings. And in doing so, they managed to create their own conditions. To work as architects, but in their own conditions, to do some kind of experimental architecture that couldn't be done in the market, in the real estate industry. So that's why I say that they were infiltrating the real estate industry. They were looking for ways to do something that couldn't be done. Finding their own financial resources and producing unconventional experimental apartments, which were new in terms of convention, but at the same time were something that could be understood by people. And this is one of the first examples of these typical, very small buildings, no more than 8 apartments, with, in this case, this is 1999, you see. In this case, usually in relatively new locations, locations that were considered not good enough before. But these architects have the perception, the sensibility to anticipate what could be happening in terms of urban renewal. And they would find a low-cost plot where to build this building, which is interesting because there are very, very little apartments, and so to create a visual expansion, they have very big windows, but to preserve sun entering the windows, they separated the balconies, which is something interesting because it gives an expansion to the apartments, to these so little apartments. And these kind of features and very subtle maneuvers within a very restricted budget allow them to produce something that was finally appreciated by the new generations of young people who were no longer, that could find in this kind of spatial expansion a better apartment than the conventional would have the conventional offer of the real estate market. So in terms of design, these young architects invested a lot of hours to obtain the more from these so restricted conditions in terms of surface, of plot, of the plot, and in terms of money. And doing so, the strange thing is that they succeeded. And they were able so to build a next building and to begin a series of buildings, introducing in each case different features, different ideas. Usually using materials that would have been considered not adequate for a residential building, or in this case, this textile facade, which was something quite new at the moment, at least in Buenos Aires. So one of the things they could do was to operate in these locations, emerging locations that were not as good for the real estate market, but they could anticipate they could work in plots that were difficult because the shape and were discarded by developers, but they could put more hours and more intelligence to work in those plots. And what is interesting of this phenomenon is that it is not one architect, but there are a lot of architects that begin to work in the same way, putting together this capital, gathering relatives and small investors, and becoming themselves the center of the project, both as developers and as architects. So as some of they succeed, others enter the game. And of course, what is interesting about the architecture is that each one developed their own strategies usually creating some kind of buffer in the facade, a double to control sunlight and using very cheap materials. In this other example, you see how the iron bars are transformed into a plastic expression for a surface that protects the building. And they usually work with double heights, taking advantage of the of the possibilities of the regulations to work into these double heights. So I would say that infiltration means that they began to work at the same time into new situations. For instance, in this case, they found a different zoning area in the city to penetrate the block in the depth and to do something that was completely new for what was usual in the city. That is to produce a building which has very small apartments, larger apartments, and townhouses, all in the same building. So all these small apartments will have, exterior spaces. These are built into double, into 2 stories apartments, and these are another 2 stories apartments. So each one will have exterior spaces. Let's detail the first. And so we were seeing this part of the building, and these are a little kind of townhouses with little gardens, and these are, well, bigger houses have some gardens, but everyone has a kind of a garden or an outer space so you can do your barbecue, which we call asado. It's so important for the Argentinians. And of course, the treatment of common spaces is very important because you got to get to the end of the plot, and this is a kind of very cheap materials that are used in an intelligent way to make this movement more fluid. And this is the way it looks at the end of the plot. This lowering building. This was made by very young people, and between the end of the 1990s and the next 10 years, and at the same time, in Mexico, you could find young architects doing exactly the same, which is very interesting because Javier Sanchez met when he got his architectural diploma. He decided to go to study abroad, and he went to Colombia, and he decided he was going to study marketing instead of more architecture. And he went back to Mexico, and he made an entrepreneurship with Higueras, which was an engineer, to start small buildings so he could do architecture in his own terms. And he began this kind of innovation in a quarter called Colonia Condesa, which has been badly hit by the earthquake of 1985. And, well, a lot of people left the quarter to go to the suburbs, to newer buildings that were supposed to be stronger. And at the moment, what happened was that Condesa was one of the few remaining pedestrian quarters in Mexico City with very rich qualities in terms of this kind of relation that you can see in the sidewalk. And with a lot of plots that had been demolished because buildings have been hit by the earthquake. So they began to buy the smallest possible plot and to build a building perhaps of 8 apartments. But they did it with such an interesting features that, well, this is one of those. And they began to work with each apartment so intensely in terms of design that this represented, well, something new, something different, something better than what people could get in the market. So this kind of combinations to make the apartments more interesting, which usually are very small, introducing new materials that were unusual in residential buildings, and making all these public spaces so interesting. And in the same way that I showed you, Buenos Aires, they use transparency with outer spaces to make feel bigger these relatively small apartments. So in the next years, Higuera y Sanchez will be building some, I think in this street, 3 or 4 buildings, one next to the other. And in each building, they were applying what they have learned from the previous one. So this idea of a tactic is that you go step by step, improving, self-adjusting, correcting what you have done and doing it better. But you are not alone. There are all another architects that are looking to you, so they can learn from you. And this is an interesting thing, I think. But following what Higueras and Sanchez did, it's very interesting because after a few years, the land prices in Condesa have grown in such a way that they were no longer able to buy plots and do this kind of small architecture with such a rich, intense design. So they moved outside to another quarters. And they produce things like this, which is a residential building has all the living areas from one side and all the bedrooms on the other side. So it has a kind of bridges. You can walk through here. They put all the cars below. You can go walk through here to your apartment, which is here on one side are the living rooms, on the other side are the bedrooms, and you cross through these bridges. So here is more or less a plan. Here is the bedroom area, and here is the living room area, and this is this internal street. So in some way, these young architects developed the ability to improve architecture doing this kind of experimentation, producing this kind of new typologies that were unheard of, that the real estate industry wouldn't have produced. And the interesting thing is that they succeeded in that a lot of people moved in, and in this other example, which is an old factory that was hit and was abandoned, they transformed it into apartments. Using the old structure and changing very little in terms of structure, they produced this building with these common spaces and few apartments that were very successful in attracting advertising people, graphic designers, architects, and so on. And this is the kind of experience you can have in these apartments. We have very high ceilings. We have a very small surface, but they have high ceilings, big transparencies, small gardens. And this is a portrait of what happened there, that how successful it was in terms of appropriation and people moving in and take advantage of these extraordinary locations, take advantage of the urban quality of the quarters, take advantage of this pedestrian possibility to live in a walkable city. Perhaps you don't know Mexico, but walkable means a lot there. The one interesting thing is that the same as in Buenos Aires, in Mexico, there were younger architects that paid attention at what Javier Sanchez did. And so a new wave of young architects developed this kind of small experimental buildings as Pardo y Amezcua, with this such a kind of blind facade, but with a very intense perforation in terms of voice into the depth of the block, producing this. Every room has a double side windows on both sides. So if you move to Brazil, you find that not in the same way, but in a similar way, we can find this kind of buildings like this one from Andrade Moretin Architects, which is in Sao Paulo, which is also a small building, but with this kind of intense design in terms of differentiation of each apartment, in terms of materials, of construction, ways of simplifying, making it easier to build, but make sense of the use of the restricted amount of money. And well, so in the same way, you could find that in each building, you can find a big variety of apartments. And again, these buildings begin to make a new landscape and transformation of the city. You see, there is the building by Andrade Moretin, and here is this new building by Triptych Arquitectos, which introduces some other features like a relation with the possibility for plants to grow along the facade, and again double heights in some cases. So the scale of the buildings is small, but the scale of the phenomenon is big. There are several people working at the same time. They are sharing an environment. They are not coordinated, but they know what each other is doing, and they learn from each other. And maybe they know each other because they are teachers in the same schools, but the effect in the city, finally, is as healthy and strong as it would have been a strategy with such big concentrated capital, or even better. Well, again, the same kind of double facade with these protections for the sun. So the idea that this is a collective process in which everyone is learning from the other, and the whole process, each building is contributing to the urban qualities. At the same time, they are raising the social expectations of what you could expect from a new apartment. And they are giving life to these old quarters that had been, well, abandoned or had been, how do you say, aging, with people more older, with older people living. So if we move now to 10 years afterwards, we see that it's a whole new generation of architects following. And for instance, Clusejas, Blinder Hanches, Cardinale Montorfano. And if you look to the apartments, to the design of the buildings, they are quite different. They are different sensibilities. They have a different sensibility in relation to architecture. But they share this kind of approach. They participate of this same process in which a collective work is being done, because some years later, these quarters have renovated themselves completely. In the case of Rosario, there's also a very interesting tradition. This one is Campodónico, which is the next generation after Iglesia. And this kind of experimentation with the concrete brings us to the last generation of young builders that are developing their own small buildings. In this case, Adamo and Faiden, which have these very small buildings, and I think that the photographs, this point of view, gives us the idea of this infiltration of the urban tissue with these new buildings. In this same case, they are looking for, well, this kind of double scheme for the facade with an intermediate space with plants. And this last building by Adamo and Faiden has this kind of very smooth surface. And they represent perhaps the last generation of the most recent generation of very young architects working in this way. working in their own terms, and if we think of ourselves as publishers, we are happy to think that we contributed to this process, that in one way we were a part of this process because we contributed to share this knowledge, which became a collective knowledge. This possibility that became a collective possibility because everyone became aware that others were successful doing this kind of architectural experimentation and being successful also in the market because these apartments sold well, at least well enough for them to do the next building. And maybe in 2000 or 2002, we published this Rafael Iglesia building in Rosario. And maybe a couple of years later, we introduced some others. Well, they go too fast. Oh, they are on their own, I think. Yes, they are on their own. So in 10 or 12 years, we like to think that we contributed to this process because a shared architectural culture developed, and what I call infiltration tactics is that the idea that you can work in small scale in a city, and because they are so numerous, those who are working this small scale, they can give a stronger intensity of design to each building, a stronger sensibility to place in the way they work, and in doing so, they produce an urban phenomenon, which was the recovery and emergence of these quarters. Whole quarters of Buenos Aires became very fashionable, grew up, their property prices grew incredibly, and the same happened with Condesa in Mexico. So what you are seeing is that architecture is creating value. And may think that this is very interesting because this means that more design produces better value, which is not so obvious for the real estate industry. So I think that in our case, it's beginning to be seen by the rest of society that this idea, this way of doing, which I call infiltration tactics, has to do with extension, sometimes with conservation, with hybridation, responsiveness, adaptation, self-construction in many ways, that they are plural, they are multiple, they are gradual, they are progressive, they are self-informed, they self-adjust to what is being happening, and finally, they are collective. It's something that is shared by the community of architects, but also because the process happens along the time, is shared by the community, and these are no longer strange apartments that architects do. These are now kind of apartments that people have appropriated. It's part of the culture of the city. And I think that this is very interesting in terms of what kind of relation these young architects establish with not only with the possibility of working in their own terms, but the kind of relation that established with society, producing new kind of types, building types, but these kind of building types that have been accepted by the people and have produced an urban value that is seen in the new life of these urban quarters. I think that, well, the answer to the question how to make a livable city, if this is true, is altogether now. You know the authors. Thank you. Forgive my English. You are very kind.
Thank you, Fernando. In the Americas, it's very easy to focus on wonderful buildings designed by talented architects and designed for single families. The villas are usually fill magazines. They fill glossy journals such as Architectural Digest and so on. But I think it's interesting that you focus on the apartment building. That is one area where there's a lot of innovation in South America or Latin America. And my experience has been going to Mexico, going to Condesa, visiting people like Derek Delica. Doesn't sound like a very Mexican name, but he is actually Mexican. There is an incredible, not just intelligence, but you have the conditions that are that much more lenient, that much more tolerant of those kinds of experimentation. And of course you have this fantastic climate where you don't have to have these thick packages of insulation, and you can have these buffers. So maybe you should speak a little bit about those two things, the kind of the leniency of building codes and the climate.
Well, climate is milder than yours, but also technology is far behind you. So things are much more simpler, and you architects must make livable a building with very few resources in terms of isolations and I think that the budgets are so small that this kind of double facades is one thing they have been working a lot. In the cases as Brazil, air simply goes by. It's very mild weather. That's the same for Mexico, I think. That temperature is almost the same all the year. And the other thing you mentioned
Building codes.
was building codes. Well, building codes in two aspects. They are not that strong in terms of environmental behavior of the buildings, but they are quite, well, the interesting thing is that these young architects found the way to work into the little spaces that the codes left them to improve and change the established typologies. So this was one of their best, to work within these regulations and the little letter of the regulations to obtain these possibilities.
Any questions from?
I think your analysis is very interesting, and I also think the projects are really inspiring and have a really high quality. But what I'm wondering is how much the young architects really refer to the quarters you're talking about, because you were mentioning that after building some of these houses, the rent all increase a lot. But what I think is strange that they do not, all of them seem to build lofts for the highest class of the society, and none of them is is really working with the people that lived there originally, you know. So
Well, they are cheaper than they look.
I'm not sure.
They are much more cheaper than, how to say, this is not for poor people, but it's for it's for young people with very little money. So they look quite better than they are. I think that is part of what they accomplished.
Can you give the price? How much is one of those? What is one of those apartments?
The surface?
No, the cost of euro.
I don't know if it makes sense because of the so strange exchange conditions we have. I don't know if it makes sense, but maybe these small apartments are between 50,000 euros and 70,000 euros.
And how does that compare to the market?
How they are compared?
To the rest of the apartments?
The same on square meter, the same.
Right.
But the quality of the spatial qualities and the locations are a little better. And usually the price would be the same, but they are better in terms of architecture. And what is, I found it strange, but mostly interesting, is that people was able to recognize these architectural values.
So what's the average,
That this is a very unusual thing.
what's the average income of those couples or people buying those?
Oh, well, I wouldn't know, but maybe they wouldn't buy it by themselves because usually credit is not that easy to get in our countries. And they would have some help from their families, and maybe they pay half and half. Half with this kind of help, and half with their own savings.
You have been explaining, and I think the question of the student was in that sense asked. You are focusing very much, not you, this group of young people in this intermediate level of the society where people can buy a small apartment with great spatial quality and so on, with help of the families and so on. Bill Friedman was referring to it as opposite to the, say, luxurious housing that have another quite different origin and destiny. But there are also linked to this high quality, sometimes architectural examples in Latin America. And I would think, for example, in the work of Barragán in Mexico, that was building for, in many cases, for himself. These houses that was sold to rich families and so on. You had this part of the level. You have the one that you're showing today. And how is it with social housing? Is it never the possibility, and other young architects never having the chance or the interest in getting into?
Yes, they have. But social housing depends from the state. The state has not been building social housing. And when they did, in our case, at least in the Argentinian case, they did little houses outside the city. One with not that with no competition, architectural competitions, and that was really bad. So social housing is an issue, but it was not there for them. So because it was not there, they said, well, what we do? Create our own conditions. Or we work within the market conditions, we don't like them, or what we do. There are no architectural competitions there is no social housing. There's no place for us. What will we do? Shall we go to the big offices to help them produce the towers? or can we find a path for us? A place where we could do experimental architecture. And the very interesting thing for me is that they did it, but they did it with certain constrictions. They couldn't do anything. They had to do something that could work for most of the people, not only for architects themselves. And in doing so, this architecture established a dialogue with society, a much better and creative dialogue. And so this intense design effort that they put in their projects, the interesting thing is that was recognized by the people. So people pay for this quality. And this is something relatively new for architecture, to have a dialogue with ordinary people.
The questioner asked you actually in a very diplomatic way.
Yes.
Whether gentrification is not a problem in...
Yes, of course. Of course. You see, one of these quarters, they are no longer affordable for these kind of people. So if you were lucky enough to buy an apartment to Javier Sanchez some 15 years ago, now maybe you are willing to sell it because it's so much, value has rise so much that you could do something, go some farther to not such an interesting quarter, but now gentrification in Condesa is one of the most expensive quarters. But it is also interesting if you think about it, because who created this value? It was design. It was not a financial operation. It was design itself. And it was little by little, drop by drop. Put together, they made something new, where the experts of the market wouldn't have thought to invest. This is interesting.
In the case of Buenos Aires, I think you have to overlap it with the phenomenon of the country clubs, of all the people living in the city center to the periphery in this sort of protected Truman world, Truman show. And this accelerated in certain areas gentrification as well, because it's, there was an opportunity created to that some people resisted going out. And they discovered the qualities of this, Palermo and all these things that slowly started to happen as well, which was great.
Well, the alternative for young people is to go to the suburbs and live in a low density, a very low density new quarter made by the developers with no public transportation, little services and low quality infrastructure. And well, I didn't show that, but it's what I wanted to show to contrast this situation, what is happening with these enclaves of high rise, very high rise, which are of very different apartment sizes. You have the luxury ones and you have the small apartments, high rise too.
Here he should really confess that he's actually presenting a strategy for urban life. What you were saying, the country clubs are those closed gated communities where people or developers take agricultural property and they fence off bits of land and they are sold to fairly wealthy people, and they ask talented young architects to design a fantastic villa, and so you get this kind of compilation of villas in these sites. And people drive around with 1 or 2 or 3 cars because that's what you have to do to get there and to move around. So that is a reality in Argentina and other places in Latin America, this kind of gated community. And what you are saying, and that's what I'm suggesting, is that you are offering this as a strategy for urban
renewal, yes. But the lady had further doubts.
Thank you for answering my question so far. But somehow, I don't know, as a European, I wonder if there's not even more possibilities because, as you say, all these young architects have so much power and so much knowledge, and some of them are even, I don't know, somehow prominent. And so I wonder, for example, in the ground floor, what we've seen, if you compare the tower you were showing in the beginning, it's somehow really similar to the apartment building, except of the material of the fence, because what I do basically is I have my car, I press the button inside the car, I drive inside the garage, and then and everything closes, and that's it. So why don't these young architects start to do something public in the ground floor? Or why don't they start mixing housing and living?
Well, it depends a lot on urban regulations. We have regulations from the 70s and 60s that would allow you to build more if you put the building, you retreat from the street and such a things. So in some cases, this is not possible within the regulations. So you are forced by regulations. And that's the reason why I show one of those which was built into an industrial quarter. So they could build into the depth of the plot from the facade to the, and it's quite a different situation. But they found it was possible because it was a different kind of zoning there. But I wanted to go back just for a minute what your first question. And this is a problem. I don't have a solution. I'm pointing to the interesting part of the thing. But yes, gentrification is after these people rediscovered these quarters. Gentrification is first is renewal. Everyone is happy. Then there are more stronger economic forces coming, and in some quarters like Palermo Viejo, Buenos Aires, I mention it because Juan Lucas knows, business will come into to put shops, and most of residentials perhaps existing, not this, but all the buildings will be replaced by shops. And then a whole process of gentrification and transformation of the quarter that you would have wanted to stop, but it continues until it's broken. So the life and death of a city, as Jane Jacobs would have said, life of death is life and death. You go better, you begin to go worse, because success is not that good. It's better to be in a low profile. But in some cases, these quarters are very nice, and although values have gone up, they are really nice, and they have produced an authentic renewal of these urban quarters.
More questions?
Thank you. So we're talking more or less about the dynamics of capitalism when we speak about transformation or gentrification. This is just a sign for the dynamics in capitalism. So can you tell something about the impact the financial crisis in Argentina had on the building culture during the early century?
Yes, a lot.
How did it have impact on the buildings you showed us?
A lot, because a lot of these buildings were built because of that crisis. Because that crisis means that people lost their money. They no longer trusted on paper, so they invested in bricks. And a lot of money went to bricks because of the crisis. And in some way, the crisis stimulated part of this phenomenon. It was.
So it's the same as in Europe.
Just 10 years earlier.
So Argentina had two sets of crises. One around 2001.
That's the big one, yes.
That's a big one. And then you had one recently.
We're no longer able to distinguish. We're always in crisis, you know? We're experts in crisis. We don't even mind. We feel fine. So.
I think Argentina is in a very difficult situation, one has to say. Just to give you one example, it is not permitted for Argentinians to exchange money within Argentina. Imagine that, basically. And until recently, it was impossible to import books into Argentina. So it's like,
Or any other thing.
or many other things, but I mean, just think about, not having a freedom of publication. So, I mean, there are serious problems with the country, but it also has a very rich culture, it has Brazilian people, and very imaginative art.
Well, I would like to say that we export Suma to Brazil. We make a Brazilian edition in Portuguese. And because we export the printed thing, we are in difficulty to import the paper. We need to export the printed thing. So it's really chaotic, the situation. But well.
I mean, it's not a problem of publication prohibitions, although it has to do with the fact that the government doesn't allow imports in order to undermine the national industry. So this is a protectionism kind of thing. So if you are importing cars, you have to sell grapes. So you have to keep the balance of just a bit great.
Two more questions.
Yeah, just a really short question. I was wondering if those areas you were showing, if those areas are like in the outskirts of the city, or they're just...
Oh, they are inner quarters of the city that remained a little aside. And they had decayed in some way because maybe people was getting older. And at some point, they were rediscovered. But who were the rediscoverers? These people, young architects, looking for
And
opportunities.
in terms of criminality, is there...
I'm sorry?
Are those parts criminal? I mean, is this dangerous being there? Or why are they so cheap? Or why is it possible to build for young architects? Be so experimental about this?
Because they're always looking the opportunity. They don't look to already consecrated locations. They look for new locations, but they are not. They are more risk. They take more risk than the real estate industry would. But they know better. So these are good places. You can trust them. They have the sensibility of urban life. What is going to become a good place to live in?
One more question.
You were always talking about young architects, and I'm wondering what happens to these architects when they get old.
They get old.
Good question. Yes.
Architects don't get old.
Yes, they are already old. Because this story began in 1999, and that's 15 years from now, almost. So they are quite older. But the good thing, I think, is that most of them are teachers in the school. And their pupils did the same way. So Adamo Faiden worked with Linda Hanches before. They didn't learn from nothing. They learned from the others. So it's a change. It's a culture. It's architectural culture. It's not one man doing things. It's a group of people. It's a collective process. And this is what I find interesting. Of course, you could also dig or get interested in the artistic aspect of each one of them, which is also interesting. But I think that the whole process is so, how do you say, informative. It so teaches us something that could be used elsewhere. So I'm trying to stress in the process and not in the artistic merits that they have. For instance, Rafael Iglesias, which Enrique knows well, he's such a good quality of very interesting. But I just wanted to go through the differences even between the different architects.
Fernando, Diez, thank you very much. I would like to, before I complete the thanks, I would like to say welcome to Francine Aubin, who's here, and she will in fact give a lecture tomorrow at the Akademie der Künste at 7 o'clock in Hanseatenweg as part of the exhibition Culture City, Kulturstadt. Francine Aubin has a project in the exhibition, which is the Birmingham Library, and she will be speaking about the projects of her office, which she's the director of, the
Meccano.
partner, Meccano. One of the very few offices that is led by a woman, I should say. There are many partnerships, but there are very few that are actually led by a woman. So, very welcome, Francine Aubin, and you're all very welcome to the lecture tomorrow. Fernando Diez, thank you for an appetizing lecture. I think it's when you spoke about asado, you should have had a picture of asado for everybody to get really hungry. I think with all the problems that we've discussed, Argentina is not the only interesting country in Latin America, but certainly one of the most, for Europeans, one of the most approachable, because it is very European. It has Italian, Spanish, and other traditions. It's a very dense culture, and then as you travel away from Buenos Aires, you slowly start to get into the flavor of Latin America, South America, and I think it's a good place to start, at least from my perspective. So, thank you very much for that fantastic lecture.
Thank you for your patience.